My name is Emily Stone, and for most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough, behaved well enough, and made the right choices, my family would love me the way parents are supposed to love their children. I was 18 years old when I learned how wrong I was. From the outside, my family looked perfect. We lived in a beautiful two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly trimmed and every driveway seemed to hold a shiny new car. My father, Richard Stone, owned a successful accounting firm. My mother, Patricia Stone, served on charity committees and spent most of her time organizing community events that made our family look even more respectable. To our neighbors, we were the ideal American family. But what people saw from the outside wasn't the same thing as what happened behind closed doors. In our house, appearances were everything. My mother treated our family like a carefully managed public relations campaign. Every outfit, every grade, every friendship, and every decision had to fit the image she wanted to project. I learned that lesson early. When I was 12, I got second place in a regional science competition. I remember walking through the front door, excited to show my parents the silver medal hanging around my neck. Most parents would have congratulated their child. My mother looked at the medal and asked one question: who got first place? That was it. Not congratulations, not you worked hard. Just one question: who got first place? When I told her another student had won, she simply nodded and said, "Next time, work harder." That moment taught me something important. In our family, being good wasn't enough. You had to be perfect, and even then, perfection usually went unnoticed. I spent years trying to earn approval that never seemed to come. Straight A's, honor roll, volunteer work, part-time jobs. I did everything I could think of. But no matter what I accomplished, there was always something missing. Something better I could have done. Someone I could have been more like. The truth was that my parents didn't really see me. They saw a reflection of themselves. And if that reflection wasn't flawless, they considered it a failure. My younger brother, Daniel, had a completely different experience. Daniel could do almost anything and get away with it. Bad grades? He was just going through a phase. Missed curfew? He was finding himself. Expensive mistakes? Boys mature slower. The excuses never ended. Meanwhile, I was held to standards that seemed impossible to reach. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe every family was like this. Maybe every daughter felt invisible. But as I got older, I realized something wasn't right, especially when it came to my future. My parents had already planned every detail of my life. They wanted me to attend a prestigious university, marry someone successful, have the right career, live in the right neighborhood. Everything was mapped out. The only problem was that nobody had asked what I wanted. By the time I turned 18, I felt like I was living inside a script someone else had written. And then I met Jake. Jake wasn't part of the plan. He worked part-time at a local auto repair shop while taking classes at a community college. He wasn't wealthy. His family wasn't influential. He didn't wear expensive clothes or drive a luxury car. In my parents' eyes, he was exactly the kind of person I should avoid, which was probably why I liked him so much. Jake was genuine. He listened when I talked. He cared about my dreams instead of telling me what they should be. Around him, I didn't feel like a project that needed improvement. I felt like a person. We met during my senior year of high school. What started as casual conversations slowly turned into something more. For the first time in my life, I had someone who accepted me exactly as I was. Of course, I kept the relationship secret. If my parents found out I was dating someone they considered beneath our social status, there would have been endless arguments. So I learned to be careful. Careful with phone calls, careful with text messages, careful with where we met. It wasn't ideal, but it felt worth it, because being with Jake made me happy, and happiness was something I rarely experienced at home. Months passed, graduation came and went, summer arrived. On the surface, everything seemed normal. My parents were busy making plans for my future. I was preparing for college, and Jake and I were spending every free moment together before life pulled us in different directions. Looking back now, that summer feels strangely peaceful, like the calm before a storm, because I had no idea that everything was about to change. One ordinary morning, I woke up feeling sick. At first, I blamed stress, then exhaustion, then maybe a stomach bug. But as the days passed, a small voice in the back of my mind started whispering a possibility I didn't want to consider, a possibility that terrified me. I remember standing in a pharmacy, staring at a shelf filled with pregnancy tests. My hands were shaking. I kept telling myself there was no reason to panic. Everything would be fine. I was probably overreacting. A few hours later, I locked myself inside the bathroom and waited. Those 3 minutes felt longer than any period of time I had ever experienced. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. I stared at the small plastic stick resting on the counter, and then I saw it. 2 pink lines, clear, undeniable, permanent. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air felt heavier. I remember gripping the edge of the sink because my knees threatened to give out beneath me. I was 18 years old. Unmarried, still living under my parents' roof, and pregnant. At that moment, I wasn't thinking about myself. I wasn't thinking about college, or my future, or even what came next. I was thinking about one thing: how my parents were going to react. And deep down, I already knew the answer. What I didn't know was that the conversation waiting for me would destroy my family forever. The pregnancy test sat hidden in my bedroom drawer for nearly 24 hours. I must have opened that drawer 100 times, hoping the result would somehow change. It never did. Every time I looked at those 2 pink lines, reality hit me all over again. I was pregnant, and sooner or later I would have to tell someone. The first person I told was Jake. I called him that evening and asked if we could meet. The moment he heard my voice, he knew something was wrong. "Emily, what's happened?" he asked. "Can we talk in person?" Of course. An hour later, we were sitting in his truck at a quiet park across town. The sun was beginning to set, and families were packing up after spending the afternoon outside. I stared through the windshield for several minutes. I couldn't find the words. Jake waited patiently. Finally, I reached into my purse and handed him the pregnancy test. For a few seconds, he simply stared at it. Then he looked at me, then back at the test, then back at me again. Neither of us spoke. The silence felt endless. "Oh my God," he whispered. I nodded, my eyes immediately filled with tears. I took 2 tests. Jake rubbed both hands across his face. Neither of us had expected this. We were young, we had plans, dreams, a future that suddenly looked very different. For a moment, fear appeared in his eyes. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. I was terrified too. But then he reached across the seat and took my hand. "Are you okay?" That simple question broke me, not because of what he said, but because it was the first thing he asked. Not what we were going to do, not how this happened, not who would find out, just whether I was okay. I started crying, the kind of crying that comes when you've been holding everything inside for too long. Jake pulled me into a hug and let me cry against his shoulder. Eventually, I managed to calm down. "What are we going to do?" I asked quietly. Jake took a deep breath. "I don't know." His honesty somehow felt reassuring. At least he wasn't pretending to have all the answers. "But whatever happens," he continued, "we'll figure it out together." Together. That word meant everything. For the first time since seeing those 2 pink lines, I felt slightly less alone. Unfortunately, there was still one problem. Actually, 2 problems: my mother and father. The next morning, I barely touched my breakfast. My stomach was in knots. Every time I looked at my parents sitting across from me, my anxiety got worse. My father was reading financial news on his tablet. My mother was planning some charity event over the phone. Neither of them had any idea that their perfect future for me was about to collapse. I spent the entire day trying to gather the courage to tell them. Several times I almost backed out, but eventually I realized there was no avoiding it. They were going to find out sooner or later. It had to come from me. That evening after dinner, I asked them if we could talk. Immediately, my mother looked concerned. "What happened?" I swallowed hard. My hands felt ice cold. "We need to sit down." A few minutes later, all 3 of us were in the living room, the same room where my family had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and graduations, the same room where everything was about to fall apart. I took a deep breath, then another, then another. Finally, I forced the words out. "I'm pregnant." Silence, complete silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if my brain had stopped processing information. Then my mother's face turned pale. My father's expression hardened instantly. "What did you just say?" my mother asked. "I'm pregnant." The word sounded even worse the second time. My mother stood up so fast she nearly knocked over a lamp. "No." Her voice shook. "No, no, no. It's true." My father slowly lowered his tablet onto the coffee table. His face looked colder than I had ever seen. "Who is the father?" "Jake." The moment I said his name, my mother's eyes widened. "That mechanic?" "He works at a repair shop while going to school," I said. But it didn't matter. She wasn't listening. "Oh my God." She began pacing around the room. "What are people going to say?" I blinked. That was her first concern. Not whether I was okay, not whether I needed support, not what happened next. Only what people would think. My father finally spoke. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that feels more dangerous than shouting. "Do you understand what you've done?" I nodded. "Yes." "No," he said sharply. "You don't." He stood up. "You have embarrassed this family." The words hit like a slap. "Dad, you had one job." I stared at him. "One job," he repeated. "Stay focused. Go to college. Build a future." "I can still do those things." My mother laughed bitterly. "You think anyone is going to take you seriously now?" The room suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in around me. "I'm still the same person," I said quietly. "No," my father replied. "You aren't." His words cut deeper than he realized, or maybe deeper than he cared. For the next hour, the accusations never stopped. Selfish, irresponsible, disgraceful, embarrassing. Every word felt heavier than the last. Not once did either of them ask how I was feeling. Not once did they ask what I needed. Not once did they show even a hint of compassion. Eventually, my mother sat down and crossed her arms. "What exactly do you expect us to do?" I looked between them. Honestly, I didn't know. Maybe help me, maybe support me, maybe be parents. I was hoping we'd figure this out together. My father stared at me for several seconds, then something shifted in his expression. Any remaining disappointment disappeared. What replaced it was far worse: cold determination. He pointed toward the front door, then he spoke 6 words that changed my life forever. "Then you can figure it out alone." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. The room was completely silent. My father's arm remained extended toward the front door. My mother sat frozen on the couch, and I simply stared at him. "What?" I whispered. My father didn't repeat himself immediately. He didn't need to. The expression on his face told me everything. He meant every word. "You heard me, Emily." My heart started pounding. "Dad, please." "No." His voice cut through mine like a knife. "You made an adult decision." I felt tears beginning to form. "I know I made a mistake." "A mistake?" my mother snapped. "A mistake is forgetting your homework. A mistake is missing an appointment. This isn't a mistake." She stood up and pointed at me. "You destroyed everything we've worked for." The words hit me like a punch. Destroyed everything? I wasn't a criminal. I hadn't hurt anyone. I was scared, pregnant, and desperately needed my parents. But somehow, they were treating me like an enemy. "I'm still your daughter," I said quietly. My mother's face hardened. "Right now, I don't even know who you are." Those words hurt more than anything else she had said. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. Everything I'd believed about my family was collapsing. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally were turning their backs on me during the most frightening moment of my life. My father walked toward the hallway. "Pack your things." I blinked. "What?" "You heard me." "Dad, where am I supposed to go?" "That's not my problem." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Surely this couldn't be real. Families argued, parents got angry, but they didn't throw their children out. Not over something like this. At least that's what I had always believed. My mother folded her arms. "Maybe your boyfriend can take care of you." The sarcasm in her voice was impossible to miss. I looked between them desperately, waiting, hoping, praying one of them would change their mind. Neither did. The realization finally hit me. They weren't threatening to throw me out. They were actually doing it. I turned and slowly walked upstairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. When I reached my bedroom, I closed the door and immediately burst into tears. I looked around the room where I'd spent most of my life. The posters on the wall, the books on my shelf, the trophies from years of hard work. Suddenly, none of it mattered. I grabbed an old suitcase from my closet and started packing. At first, I packed mechanically, a few shirts, jeans, shoes, toiletries. But then reality caught up with me. I had nowhere to go. No savings, no plan, no idea what came next. I sat on the edge of my bed and cried until my eyes hurt. Eventually, I forced myself to continue. I packed only what I could carry. Everything else stayed behind. Years of memories reduced to a single suitcase. When I finally came downstairs, my parents were waiting. Neither looked emotional. Neither looked conflicted. If anything, they seemed relieved, as though removing me from their lives solved a problem. My father handed me an envelope. "What's this?" "Information regarding your college fund." I opened it. The balance showed 0. My stomach dropped. "What happened?" "We closed the account." I stared at him. "You can't be serious." "That money belonged to us." I felt sick. Years of savings, gone, just like that. My mother stepped forward. "We're also removing you from our health insurance policy." I couldn't speak. The cruelty of it was overwhelming. Not only were they abandoning me, but they were making sure I had nothing to fall back on. I looked around the house one last time. Part of me still hoped someone would stop this, that my mother would suddenly hug me, that my father would tell me to stay, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, my father opened the front door. The message couldn't have been clearer. "Leave, now." I picked up my suitcase. My hands were shaking, my chest felt tight, and then I walked out. The door closed behind me. Not gently, not sadly, firmly, like a chapter ending. I stood on the sidewalk staring at the house, the same house where I had celebrated birthdays, opened Christmas presents, dreamed about my future. Now it looked different, cold, unfamiliar, almost like it had never been home at all. I reached into my pocket and called Jake. The moment he answered, I started crying. "Emily? They kicked me out." There was silence, then immediate concern. "What happened?" I told them. "Oh God." "They threw me out." His response came instantly. "Where are you?" I told him. "I'm coming." 20 minutes later, Jake's truck pulled up beside me. The moment I saw him, I broke down again. He got out and wrapped his arms around me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Eventually, he helped load my suitcase into the truck. "What now?" I asked. Jake looked worried, but unlike my parents, he wasn't running away. "We'll figure it out." Those words again. "We'll figure it out." At that moment, they were the only thing holding me together. We drove to his parents' house. I expected hesitation, questions, maybe even judgment. Instead, his mother opened the door and immediately welcomed me inside. She looked at my swollen eyes and knew something terrible had happened. Without asking for details, she pulled me into a hug. That simple act nearly made me cry all over again, because it was more compassion than my own parents had shown all night. Jake's parents let me stay in their guest room. They didn't have much money. Their house was small, nothing like the home I had grown up in, but it felt warmer than my parents' mansion ever had. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Everything hurt. My heart, my future, my faith in my family. I kept replaying the evening over and over, wondering if there was something I could have said differently, something I could have done. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't really about the pregnancy. It was about control, about expectations, about the image my parents cared about more than their daughter. Sometime after midnight, my phone buzzed. For a brief second, hope surged through me. Maybe my parents had changed their minds. Maybe they wanted to talk. Maybe they regretted what happened. Instead, I discovered they had blocked my number, both of them. The final connection was gone. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I slowly set the phone aside. The message was clear. As far as they were concerned, I no longer existed. That night, I lost my home. I lost my financial security. I lost the family I had spent 18 years trying to please. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of a house that didn't belong to me, I had no idea what the future held. I had no idea how hard the next few years would be, and I definitely had no idea that one day, the same people who abandoned me would come back begging for my help. That night, I thought I had lost everything. What I didn't realize was that my real life was only beginning. The first few weeks after being kicked out felt like I was living someone else's nightmare. Every morning I woke up hoping the previous month had been a bad dream. Then reality would hit me all over again. I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I wasn't living in my parents' house. And I wasn't the daughter they wanted. I was an 18-year-old pregnant girl sleeping in Jake's parents' guest room with no money, no support, and no idea how to build a future. The fear never really went away. It followed me everywhere. Every doctor's appointment, every grocery store trip, every time I looked at my growing stomach. Because for the first time in my life, there was nobody coming to rescue me. If I wanted a future, I would have to build it myself. Jake was trying his best. He worked longer hours at the auto repair shop and picked up extra shifts whenever he could. Some nights he came home so exhausted he could barely keep his eyes open, but he never complained. Not once. Instead, he would sit beside me and ask the same question. "How are you feeling today?" It sounds simple, but when you're surrounded by uncertainty, kindness becomes unforgettable, especially when it comes from someone who owes you nothing. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents was completely gone. No phone calls, no text messages, no emails, nothing. At first, I checked my phone constantly. Part of me believed they would eventually calm down, that they would realize I was still their daughter, that they would call and ask me to come home. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The call never came. It was like I had been erased from their lives. And the hardest part wasn't the silence. The hardest part was realizing they were choosing it every single day. As my pregnancy progressed, life became more difficult. Morning sickness gave way to constant exhaustion. My feet swelled, my back hurt. Simple tasks suddenly felt exhausting. But sitting around feeling sorry for myself wasn't an option. We needed money, a lot of it. Doctor visits weren't free, medication wasn't free, baby supplies definitely weren't free, and every time we thought we had enough savings, another unexpected expense appeared. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table staring at a pile of medical bills. The total felt impossible. I remember thinking that I had never been this scared before, not even the night I was kicked out, because back then I was only responsible for myself. Now another life depended on me. I couldn't afford to fail. That realization changed something inside me. Instead of focusing on what I'd lost, I started focusing on what I still had. I had Jake. I had a roof over my head. I had people who cared about me. And most importantly, I had a reason to keep going, so I started fighting. I found part-time work that I could still manage during pregnancy. The pay wasn't great. Most days were exhausting, but every paycheck mattered. Every dollar mattered. I learned how to stretch a budget further than I ever thought possible. I learned how to compare prices, how to save money, how to survive. And slowly, I began to realize something. The version of Emily Stone that my parents created was disappearing. The girl who constantly needed approval, the girl who worried about appearances, the girl who spent her entire life trying to be perfect. She was gone. Life didn't care about perfection. Life cared about resilience. Then, 6 months after being thrown out, everything changed again. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. I woke up with intense pain. At first, I thought it was normal pregnancy discomfort. Then the pain became stronger, and stronger, and stronger. Within hours, we were rushing to the hospital. I was terrified. Nothing prepares you for that moment. No book, no class, no advice, just fear and uncertainty. I remember gripping Jake's hand so tightly that my fingers hurt, and through every contraction, every painful moment, he stayed right beside me, never leaving, never complaining, never looking away. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound that changed my life forever. A baby crying, my baby. The nurse carefully placed a tiny little girl into my arms, and suddenly everything else disappeared. The fear, the stress, the anger, the heartbreak, all of it. For the first time, I looked into my daughter's eyes. She was perfect, tiny, beautiful, completely innocent, and in that moment something happened that I still struggle to describe. I stopped feeling sorry for myself, because suddenly this story wasn't about me anymore. It was about her, my daughter, my responsibility, my reason. Tears filled my eyes as I held her close. Jake sat beside me, staring at her with a smile I'll never forget. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. We were overwhelmed, exhausted, terrified, and happier than we'd ever been. Then I looked down at my daughter and made a promise that would guide every decision I made for the next 12 years. I whispered it quietly so only she could hear. I will never abandon you. Not when life gets hard, not when you disappoint me, not when you make mistakes, not for any reason. Because love isn't supposed to disappear when things become difficult. It's supposed to show up the most when people need it. My parents had taught me exactly what kind of parent I never wanted to become, and holding my daughter in that hospital room, I made a silent vow. She would grow up knowing she was loved. She would never have to earn it. She would never have to be perfect, and no matter what happened in the future, she would always have a home. At that moment, I didn't know how difficult the coming years would be. I didn't know how much we would struggle, or how many sacrifices we would make. But one thing became crystal clear. The scared 18-year-old girl my parents threw away was gone. A mother had taken her place, and a mother can survive things that would destroy anyone else. The first year after my daughter was born was the hardest year of my life. Nothing even came close. Not being kicked out, not losing my family, not the pregnancy, nothing. Because no matter how much you prepare yourself, becoming a parent changes everything. Especially when you're 19 years old and struggling to make ends meet. Every day felt like a balancing act. If I wasn't feeding the baby, I was working. If I wasn't working, I was cleaning. If I wasn't cleaning, I was trying to catch a few hours of sleep before starting all over again. Some nights I barely slept at all. Our daughter would wake up crying at 2 in the morning, then 4, then 6. By sunrise, I felt like a zombie. But somehow we kept going because we had no choice. Jake continued working at the repair shop. I picked up every opportunity I could find. Money was still tight, very tight. There were months when we carefully calculated every dollar before spending it. I learned how to make a week's worth of groceries last 2 weeks. I learned how to find secondhand baby clothes that looked brand new. I learned how to survive on determination when everything else was running low. And through it all, Jake never stopped showing up. That's something I think people underestimate. Everyone talks about grand romantic gestures, the flowers, the expensive gifts, the dramatic declarations of love. But real love looks different. Real love is a tired man coming home after a 10-hour shift and immediately helping with the baby. Real love is staying awake together at 3 in the morning because your daughter has a fever. Real love is facing impossible situations and refusing to leave. That's what Jake gave me. Not perfection, commitment, and that mattered more. A year after our daughter was born, we made a decision. We got married. There wasn't a huge ceremony, no expensive venue, no fancy decorations, no hundreds of guests. In fact, there were only a handful of people there. Jake's parents, a few close friends, and us. My parents weren't invited, not because I wanted revenge, but because there was no relationship left to save. The people who should have been sitting in the front row had chosen not to be part of my life. That reality still hurt, but I had stopped waiting for them to change. The wedding itself was simple, beautiful, and honest. Standing there beside Jake, holding our daughter's tiny hand, I realized something important. This was family. Not the people connected by blood, the people who stayed, the people who loved you when life became complicated, the people who chose you. After the wedding, life didn't suddenly become easier. There was no magical transformation. Bills still existed, responsibilities still existed, stress definitely still existed, but we were moving forward, slowly, steadily, together. Then one evening after putting our daughter to bed, I found myself staring at an old college brochure. It had been sitting in a drawer for months, a reminder of the future I thought I had lost, the future my parents believed I no longer deserved. I picked it up and started reading. The next day, I submitted an application. A few months later, I was officially enrolled in college, part-time, It wasn't easy. In fact, it was one of the most difficult things I've ever done. Imagine working during the day, taking care of a toddler, managing a household, and then spending late nights studying while everyone else slept. That's what my life became. Most nights, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks. The clock would read midnight. Sometimes 1 in the morning, sometimes even later. I would be exhausted, my eyes would burn, my brain would beg for sleep. But I kept going because every chapter I finished felt like a small act of defiance. Every exam I passed proved something, not to my parents, to myself. They had decided my future was over. I refused to believe them. Over the next few years, I worked harder than I ever had before, semester after semester, class after class, assignment after assignment. Slowly, the impossible started becoming possible. Our daughter grew older. Money became a little less tight. Life became a little more stable. For the first time in years, we weren't constantly in crisis mode. We could finally breathe. Not completely, but enough to see a future ahead of us. And through all of it, my parents remained silent. Birthdays passed, nothing. Holidays passed, nothing. Graduations, nothing, not even a message. At first, the silence hurt, then it became normal. Eventually, I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even waiting anymore. I had spent so much of my life trying to earn love from people who had no intention of giving it. Now my energy belonged somewhere else. To my husband, to my daughter, to the life we were building. One afternoon, while helping my daughter with a school project, she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mommy, where are your parents?" I froze. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. How do you explain abandonment to a child? How do you explain that some people choose pride over family? I thought carefully before answering. "They're not part of our lives." She looked confused. "Why?" I smiled sadly. "Because sometimes grown-ups make bad choices too." She considered that answer for a moment. Then she nodded and went back to coloring. But after she left the room, I sat there thinking. Maybe that was the simplest truth. My parents had made a choice, and every day for years they continued making it. Meanwhile, I was making my own choices. I was choosing growth. I was choosing resilience. I was choosing to build something better than what I came from. And little by little, that decision was changing everything. I didn't know it yet, but the foundation we were building during those difficult years would eventually become something far greater than I ever imagined. While my parents were pretending I didn't exist, I was quietly becoming someone they would never see coming. By the time I turned 25, my life looked completely different from the one my parents had predicted. According to them, getting pregnant at 18 should have ruined everything. I was supposed to struggle forever. I was supposed to become a cautionary tale. The daughter people whispered about at family gatherings, the embarrassing mistake nobody wanted to discuss. At least, that's what I imagined they expected. Instead, something unexpected happened. I kept moving forward, one step at a time, one goal at a time, one difficult year at a time, and eventually, all those small victories started adding up. The first major turning point came when I graduated from college. It had taken longer than it would have for most students. Balancing classes, work, marriage, and motherhood isn't exactly the traditional college experience. But honestly, I didn't care. When I walked across that stage and accepted my diploma, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: pride. Not because I had proven my parents wrong, because I had proven myself right. There had been countless moments when quitting would have been easier, moments when exhaustion almost won, moments when the future seemed impossible. But I kept going, and now I had something nobody could take away from me: an education, a future, a foundation. As I stepped off that stage, I looked toward the audience. Jake was standing and cheering louder than anyone else. Our daughter, now 6 years old, was jumping excitedly beside him. That image remains one of my favorite memories. Not because of the diploma, because of the people celebrating with me, the people who stayed. A few months later, another opportunity appeared. I landed an entry-level position at a property management and real estate company. The pay wasn't extraordinary, the office wasn't glamorous. But it was a start, and after everything I'd survived, I knew how important beginnings could be. From the very first day, I worked harder than anyone expected. I arrived early, stayed late, asked questions, volunteered for difficult projects. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I simply understood something many people don't. Opportunities aren't guaranteed. When life gives you one, you take it seriously. Years of struggle had taught me that. Slowly, people started noticing. Managers trusted me with bigger responsibilities. Clients specifically requested me. Promotions followed, then raises, then more opportunities. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was building something. A career, a reputation, a future. And the best part? Nobody had handed it to me. Every achievement was earned. Every milestone represented years of sacrifice. That made success feel different, more meaningful, more personal. Around the same time, Jake's career was improving too. He had become one of the most respected mechanics in his company. Eventually, he moved into management. Together, our income grew. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. And after spending years worrying about every dollar, steady felt amazing. One evening, while reviewing our finances at the kitchen table, Jake looked up from the paperwork and smiled. "What?" He turned the calculator toward me. "We can do it." I stared at the numbers. For a moment, I didn't understand. Then it clicked. The house. For years, we had dreamed about buying our own home. Not a mansion, not anything extravagant, just a place that truly belonged to us. A place where nobody could throw us out. A place where our daughter could grow up feeling secure. And now, for the first time, it was possible. I remember touring houses for weeks. Some were too expensive, some needed major repairs, some simply didn't feel right. Then we found it, a beautiful 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing flashy, nothing excessive. But the moment I walked inside, I knew. This was it, this was home. The day we signed the paperwork, I sat in the car afterward and cried. Not because I was sad, because I was overwhelmed. 12 years earlier, I had been standing on a sidewalk with one suitcase and nowhere to go. Now I owned a home, a real home, built through hard work and perseverance. Nobody could take that away. When we moved in, our daughter immediately claimed the largest bedroom she could find. Jake and I spent the entire weekend unpacking boxes and assembling furniture. It was exhausting and perfect. For the first time in years, life felt stable. Not easy, but stable. There was a difference. Then something happened that surprised me. One afternoon, while organizing old documents, I found a photograph from high school. It showed 18-year-old Emily Stone smiling nervously at the camera, the same Emily who desperately wanted her parents' approval. The same Emily who believed their acceptance would somehow make her complete. I stared at that picture for several minutes. Then I realized something. I no longer needed them, not emotionally, not financially, not in any way. The realization wasn't bitter, it wasn't angry, it was peaceful. For years, a small part of me had hoped they would call. Apologize, reconnect, become the parents I always wanted. But somewhere along the way, I stopped needing that outcome. Because I had built a life anyway, a good life, a happy life. Their absence no longer defined me, and that was incredibly freeing. That evening, I sat on the back porch watching the sunset while my daughter played in the yard. Jake was grilling dinner nearby. Laughter drifted through the air. Everything felt calm, comfortable, earned. I remember thinking that if my life stayed exactly like this forever, I would be grateful. Because after everything we'd survived, this felt like victory. I didn't know that hundreds of miles away, my parents' lives were beginning to unravel. I didn't know that poor decisions, financial troubles, and years of arrogance were slowly catching up to them. And I definitely didn't know that the people who had spent 12 years pretending I didn't exist were about to remember exactly who Emily Stone was. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was winning. And the people who abandoned me had no idea what was coming next. For 12 years, I heard almost nothing about my parents. And honestly, that was fine with me. I wasn't interested in keeping track of people who had made it clear they didn't want me in their lives. Still, when you grow up in a town where everybody knows everybody, information has a way of traveling. A former neighbor mentions something. An old classmate shares a rumor. Someone recognizes your last name and casually brings up your family. Most of the time, I ignored it. But looking back, the signs were there long before I realized what was happening. The perfect image my parents had spent decades building was beginning to crack. And once the cracks appeared, everything started falling apart. It began with my father. Richard Stone had always been obsessed with success, not actual happiness, not stability, success. or at least the appearance of success. He measured people by their income, their job titles, their homes, and their social status. In his mind, wealth wasn't simply something you had, it was proof that you mattered. For years, that mindset seemed to work. His accounting firm was successful, his reputation was strong, people respected him. But then, things started changing. Several longtime clients retired, others moved their business elsewhere. Competition increased, the economy shifted. Suddenly, the easy profits weren't so easy anymore. Most business owners would have adapted. My father doubled down instead. Rather than reducing expenses, he increased them. Rather than becoming cautious, he became desperate. And desperate people often make bad decisions. According to what I later learned, he began investing heavily in risky ventures, commercial real estate projects, private investment opportunities, business partnerships that promised enormous returns. On paper, everything looked impressive. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Then there was my mother. Patricia Stone had spent her entire life chasing appearances, luxury vacations, designer clothing, country club memberships, expensive charity events. Everything had to project success. Everything had to maintain the image. Even when money became tighter, she refused to adjust her lifestyle. Instead of cutting back, she kept spending. Because admitting financial problems would mean admitting imperfection, and my mother would do almost anything to avoid that. Unfortunately, appearances don't pay bills. Eventually, the financial pressure started growing, then growing more, then becoming impossible to ignore. But perhaps the biggest problem wasn't my parents. It was Daniel, my younger brother, the golden child, the son who could do no wrong, the son who spent his entire life being rescued from consequences. When we were younger, every mistake Daniel made was excused. Every bad decision was explained away. Every failure became someone else's fault. At the time, I thought it was unfair. What I didn't realize was that my parents were creating a much bigger problem. They never taught him responsibility, and eventually, reality came collecting. By his late 20s, Daniel had accumulated significant debt. Credit cards, personal loans, failed business ideas, expensive purchases he couldn't actually afford. Every time he got into trouble, my parents bailed him out. Again and again and again. The cycle never stopped because they couldn't admit that their perfect son was deeply irresponsible. So instead of solving the problem, they kept feeding it. And every rescue made things worse. By the time Daniel turned 30, he wasn't just struggling financially, he was drowning. The worst part? My parents were drowning right beside him. One afternoon, I received a phone call from an old family acquaintance, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Most of the conversation was ordinary, then she casually mentioned something strange. "Your parents sold their vacation property." That caught my attention. The vacation property had always been one of my father's prized possessions. Selling it would have been unthinkable, at least years earlier. "Really?" I asked. Apparently they needed the money. Needed the money. The phrase stayed with me long after the conversation ended, because my parents would never voluntarily sell something they considered a status symbol. Not unless they had no choice. At the time, I didn't think much more about it. I was busy living my own life. But behind the scenes, the situation continued deteriorating. Investments failed, debt increased, assets disappeared, and eventually my parents reached a point they never imagined possible. They were running out of options, fast. The irony wasn't lost on me when I eventually learned the full story. The people who had thrown away their daughter to protect the family's reputation were now watching that reputation collapse anyway. Not because of me, because of their own choices, the very choices they had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Then came the final blow, the problem that turned a difficult situation into a full-blown crisis. It involved family property that had been in the family for decades, property everyone assumed belonged entirely to my parents, property they desperately needed to sell. At first, they believed it would solve everything. The debts, the loans, the financial pressure. One sale could fix it all. There was only one problem. When they started preparing the paperwork, a hidden complication surfaced. A complication connected to a man who had been gone for years. My grandfather. The one person in the family who had occasionally shown me kindness when I was growing up. And buried inside old legal documents was a detail nobody expected to find, a detail that changed everything. Because according to those documents, my parents didn't fully control the property they were trying so desperately to sell. Someone else had a say, someone they hadn't spoken to in 12 years, someone they had thrown out of their home, someone whose signature they now desperately needed. And when my parents finally discovered that fact, panic quickly turned into something else. Fear. Because for the first time in over a decade, Richard and Patricia Stone were about to face a reality they never saw coming. The daughter they abandoned wasn't powerless anymore, and whether they liked it or not, their future now depended on Emily Stone. The first sign that something was wrong came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. At the time, I had no idea my parents were in trouble. I had no idea they were drowning in debt. And I definitely had no idea that my name had suddenly become the most important name in their lives. As far as I knew, Richard and Patricia Stone were still happily pretending I didn't exist. I was at work reviewing contracts when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored unknown numbers. Working in property management meant I received enough spam calls to know better, so I sent it straight to voicemail. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. The same number. I ignored it again, then a third time. Now I was annoyed. Whoever it was clearly wasn't giving up. I waited until my lunch break before checking the voicemail. The moment I pressed play, I nearly dropped the phone. A familiar voice filled my ear. "Emily, it's Mom." I froze. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was imagining things. 12 years. 12 years of silence. 12 birthdays. 12 Christmases. 12 years without a single phone call. And suddenly there she was, like no time had passed at all. The message continued. "I know this is unexpected. We need to talk. Please call me back as soon as possible." That was it. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the past, just "we need to talk." I listened to the voicemail 3 more times. Each time it sounded stranger, because something felt off. My mother wasn't reaching out because she missed me. I knew that immediately. People don't ignore their daughter for 12 years and suddenly wake up wanting a relationship. Something else was happening. I just didn't know what. When I got home that evening, Jake immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened?" I handed him my phone. He listened to the voicemail. His eyebrows rose. "Well, that's unexpected. That's one word for it." "What are you going to do?" I thought about it. Part of me wanted to delete the message and move on. Another part was curious. After 12 years, what could possibly be important enough to make my mother call? The next morning, I received another voicemail, then another, then an email, then a text message. Each communication carried the same message. "We need to talk. Urgently, urgently." That word stood out. Urgent for who? Certainly not for me. My life was fine. So if something was urgent, it was urgent for them. And that made me suspicious. By the end of the week, curiosity finally won. I called the number back. My mother answered immediately, almost as though she had been staring at the phone waiting. "Emily." The excitement in her voice felt strangely forced, artificial, like an actor reading from a script. "Hi, Mom." The word felt foreign. There was a brief silence, then she laughed nervously. "It's been so long." 12 years. I didn't say it, but we both knew it. "Why are you calling?" I decided to skip the small talk. Her response came quickly. "I'd really prefer to discuss this in person." There it was. The first red flag. If someone refuses to explain why they're calling, it's usually because they know you won't like the answer. "What is this about?" Another pause, then she said something interesting. "It concerns the family." The family, not me, not us, the family. Somehow that made me trust her even less. Eventually, we agreed to meet the following Saturday at a local cafe. When I hung up, I felt strangely unsettled. Something wasn't right, and deep down I already knew it. What I didn't know was how desperate my parents had become, because while I was deciding whether to meet them, chaos was unfolding behind the scenes. A few weeks earlier, my father had finally found a buyer for a valuable piece of family property. A large property that had belonged to my grandfather before his death. Selling it would solve almost all of their financial problems. The debt, the loans, the mounting pressure, everything. Naturally, my father expected the sale to be simple. After all, he believed the property belonged to him, or at least mostly belonged to him. Then the attorneys started reviewing the paperwork, and that's when they found it. A clause hidden inside my grandfather's estate documents. A clause nobody had paid attention to for years. According to the documents, ownership of the property had been divided. Not equally, but significantly, and one of the beneficiaries was me, Emily Stone, the daughter nobody had spoken to since she was 18, the daughter everyone assumed had disappeared from their lives forever. Apparently, my grandfather had made the change shortly before his death. Nobody knew exactly why, at least not yet. But the legal impact was clear. Without my approval, the property couldn't be sold. Without my signature, the deal was dead. Without my signature, my parents remained trapped. At first, my father reportedly thought it was a mistake. Then he became angry. Then he became desperate. Because the timing couldn't have been worse. Creditors were demanding payment, loans were coming due, investments had failed, and suddenly everything depended on a daughter they had abandoned. The irony was almost unbelievable. 12 years earlier, they had decided I was worthless. Now a single signature from me was worth millions. By the time Saturday arrived, I still didn't know any of this. I simply knew my mother wanted something important, something urgent. As I prepared to leave for the meeting, Jake stood beside the front door. "You okay?" I nodded. "I think so." "You don't owe them anything." His words lingered in my mind, because he was right. I didn't owe them anything. Not my time, not my forgiveness, not my trust, and certainly not my signature. Still, I needed answers. So I got into my car and drove toward the cafe. What I didn't realize was that I was driving toward the first conversation with my mother in 12 years. A conversation that would reveal exactly why she had suddenly remembered my existence. And by the time that meeting ended, one thing would become painfully clear. She hadn't come back because she loved me. She had come back because she needed me. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early, partly because I wanted time to think, partly because I wasn't sure if I would actually go through with it. For 12 years, I had imagined what it would feel like to see my mother again. Sometimes I imagined an apology, sometimes I imagined anger, sometimes I imagined nothing at all. But sitting in that parking lot staring at the entrance, I realized something. I felt surprisingly calm, not because the past didn't matter, because it no longer controlled me. The 18-year-old girl who had been thrown out of her home would have been terrified. The 30-year-old woman sitting behind the steering wheel wasn't. I had survived too much to be intimidated now. After taking a deep breath, I walked inside. The cafe was busy but quiet. People worked on laptops. Friends chatted over coffee. Nobody paid attention to me. At first, I didn't see her. Then I noticed a woman sitting alone near the window. My mother, Patricia Stone. For a moment, it felt strange. 12 years had changed both of us. Her hair was grayer, the lines on her face were deeper. She looked older than I remembered, more tired too. But what surprised me most was how little emotion I felt. No overwhelming anger, no overwhelming sadness, just distance. The emotional connection had faded years ago. She spotted me immediately and stood up. "Emily." Her voice sounded almost relieved, as though she'd been worried I wouldn't show up. I approached the table. "Mom." There was an awkward pause, then she leaned forward as if she intended to hug me. Instinctively, I stepped back. The disappointment on her face lasted only a second before she covered it with a smile. "Of course," she said quietly. "I understand." No, she didn't. If she understood, we wouldn't have been sitting here after 12 years of silence. We sat down across from each other. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. "You look wonderful." I nodded politely. "Thank you." "And your family?" "They're doing well." Her smile tightened slightly. Maybe she wasn't expecting me to mention my family, or maybe she remembered that she wasn't part of it. Either way, she quickly changed the subject. "I saw some photos online. That surprised me. You've been looking me up?" "Oh, occasionally." Occasionally. The word sounded harmless, but it annoyed me. For 12 years she hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't visited. Yet apparently she'd found time to monitor my life from a distance, like a stranger browsing social media. The conversation drifted into awkward small talk. My daughter, my job, my house. Every question felt carefully chosen, and every answer felt strangely one-sided, because while she kept asking about my life, she wasn't really sharing anything about hers. That alone made me suspicious. Then something happened. For the first time since I sat down, she stopped smiling. She looked nervous, almost uncomfortable. And suddenly I knew. Here it comes, the real reason. She folded her hands together. Emily, I know things didn't end well between us. I stared at her. Didn't end well? That was certainly one way to describe being thrown out while pregnant. Still, I remained silent. She continued. Families go through difficult periods. Difficult periods. Again, an interesting choice of words. Not abandonment, not rejection, not 12 years of silence, just a difficult period. The way she minimized everything was almost impressive. Finally, I decided to stop playing along. What do you want, Mom? The question hung in the air. For a moment, she looked caught off guard. Then she laughed softly. What do you mean? I mean you ignored me for 12 years. Her smile disappeared. You suddenly start calling, emailing, and texting me. I leaned forward slightly. So let's skip the performance. What do you want? The silence that followed told me everything. She wasn't offended, she wasn't shocked, because she knew I was right. Eventually she sighed, then she reached into her designer handbag. Despite everything happening, she still carried herself like the same Patricia Stone. Appearances first, always. A few seconds later, she placed a large folder on the table, and there it was, the answer. Paperwork, of course, not a family photo, not an apology letter, not an invitation to reconnect. Paperwork. I stared at the folder, then looked at her. What is this? She hesitated, another bad sign, then she pushed the folder toward me. It concerned some family property. Family property, there was that phrase again. Not family relationships, not family healing, property. I slowly opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, ownership records, contracts, property valuations. The deeper I looked, the clearer the situation became, and with every page my suspicion grew. Because these weren't casual documents. This was serious, very serious. I looked up. Why am I reading this? My mother shifted uncomfortably. For the first time since I'd arrived, she looked genuinely nervous, because she knew the moment had come, the moment she could no longer avoid the truth. Your grandfather made some changes before he passed away. I said nothing. She continued. Those changes affect ownership rights. Ownership rights. Interesting, very interesting, because suddenly I understood why she was here, and it had absolutely nothing to do with reconciliation, nothing to do with regret, nothing to do with love. This was business, desperate business. I turned another page, then another, and then I found it. My name, Emily Stone, printed clearly beside a significant ownership percentage. For a second, I thought I was misunderstanding. I looked again. No, the documents were very clear. My grandfather had left me a substantial stake in the property, a stake large enough to block any sale, a stake large enough to create serious problems, a stake large enough to make me suddenly very important. I slowly closed the folder. The entire situation finally made sense. 12 years of silence, then urgent phone calls, urgent meetings, urgent conversations, because they needed something. Specifically, they needed me, or more accurately, they needed my signature. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, and for the first time since arriving, I saw genuine fear staring back at me, because she knew I had figured it out. The woman sitting across from me hadn't come back for her daughter. She had come back for a document, and at that moment, everything became painfully clear. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The folder sat between us on the cafe table like a confession neither of us wanted to touch. I stared at the documents, then at my mother, then back at the documents. 12 years without a phone call, without a birthday card, without a single attempt to reconnect. And now suddenly my signature was important. The realization should have hurt. Instead, it mostly made me tired, because deep down, I think I had already known the truth before I walked into the cafe. I just needed confirmation, and now I had it. I slowly closed the folder and folded my hands. So that's why you're here. My mother's expression tightened. Emily, no, I shook my head. Let's be honest for once. The words came out calmer than I expected. Maybe because I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires emotional investment, and after 12 years, there wasn't much left. You didn't call because you missed me. She looked away. You didn't call because you wanted a relationship. Silence. You called because you need something. The silence grew heavier. Finally, she sighed. Yes. At least she wasn't lying. That was something. Not much, but something. I leaned back in my chair. What exactly do you need? My mother took a deep breath, then she told me everything. Or at least most of it. The family property was worth millions. A buyer had already been found. The sale was supposed to close within a few weeks. Without my signature, the entire deal would collapse. At first, she tried presenting it as a simple business issue, a minor complication. But the more she talked, the clearer the situation became. This wasn't a minor complication. This was a disaster. Their disaster. Debt had piled up, investments had failed, loans were coming due. The sale wasn't just important, it was essential. Without it, they were in serious trouble. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, my parents had treated me like a burden. Now I was the only thing standing between them and financial collapse. When she finally finished explaining, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I asked the question that mattered. Why didn't you tell me about this ownership years ago? Her eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected that. We didn't think it was necessary. I almost laughed. Not necessary, of course, because as long as everything was going well, I didn't matter. I was only necessary now that they needed something. The pattern was painfully familiar. Then another question occurred to me. Did Grandpa do this intentionally? That question seemed to make her uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. She shifted in her chair. I'm not sure. The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed, too careful, which meant she was hiding something. I noticed it immediately. What aren't you telling me? Nothing. Mom. She looked down at the table, and that was all the answer I needed. There was definitely more. After a long silence, she finally spoke. Your grandfather knew about what happened. The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were shocking, because they confirmed something I'd wondered about for years. My grandfather had known, the one family member who occasionally showed me kindness, the one person who never judged me. He knew. What did he say? My mother's jaw tightened. He wasn't happy. I nodded slowly. That sounded like Grandpa. He wasn't the type to scream or argue, but disappointment from him carried weight, a lot of weight. What else? Again, hesitation, then another reluctant answer. He thought your father and I were too harsh. Too harsh. I nearly laughed. Being thrown out while pregnant was apparently too harsh. The understatement would have been funny if it weren't so ridiculous. My mother continued. He believed families should stay together. There it was, the truth, or at least part of it. My grandfather had disagreed with what they did, and somehow I suspected that disagreement had influenced the document sitting in front of me. For the first time, I started understanding why my name appeared in those papers. Maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe it wasn't a technicality. Maybe Grandpa had planned this. The possibility lingered in my mind. Then my mother reached across the table. Emily, regardless of the past, we need your help. There it was again. Need, not love, not regret, need. I pulled my hands back before she could touch them. Regardless of the past? Her expression faltered. You abandoned me. The words came out quietly, but they landed hard. You threw me out of your house while I was pregnant. She looked uncomfortable. Good, she should. You blocked my number. Silence. You ignored your granddaughter for 12 years. More silence. The cafe suddenly felt very quiet, even though dozens of people surrounded us. My mother swallowed. We all made mistakes. I stared at her. Then I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We all made mistakes, as if our actions were somehow equal, as if being pregnant at 18 was the same as abandoning your child. The lack of accountability was breathtaking. No, I said firmly. We did not all make mistakes. Her face hardened slightly. The familiar Patricia Stone was returning. The woman who hated being challenged. The woman who believed she was always right. Emily, holding on to anger isn't healthy. That sentence told me everything, because she still didn't understand. Or maybe she refused to understand. This wasn't about anger, it was about consequences. For 12 years, they had lived as though their actions carried none. Now reality had arrived, and they didn't like it. Then she delivered the line I should have expected, the line every entitled family member eventually uses. Family is family. I stared at her for a moment, then I slowly nodded. You're right. Relief flashed across her face, too soon, because I wasn't finished. Family is family. I leaned forward slightly, which makes it even harder to understand why you abandoned yours. The color drained from her face. For the first time since the conversation began, she had no response. None. Because there wasn't one. You can't spend 12 years ignoring your daughter and suddenly claim family matters. Not when you only remember family after running out of options. The silence stretched between us. Heavy, uncomfortable, revealing. And in that moment, I made a decision, a very important decision. Because for the first time in 12 years, the balance of power had completely shifted. They needed me, not the other way around. And before I signed anything, Richard and Patricia Stone were finally going to face something they had avoided for over a decade, the consequences of their choices. The silence at the table felt different now. Earlier, it had been awkward. Now it was heavy with something else. Power shifting. My mother sat across from me, waiting for me to say yes, waiting for me to be the daughter she remembered only when she needed something. But I wasn't that version of Emily anymore, not even close. I slowly pushed the folder back toward her. I'm not signing anything. For a moment, she didn't react. It was like her brain needed time to process the sentence. Then she leaned forward slightly. Emily, don't be emotional about this. That word again. Emotional. As if my decision had nothing to do with logic. As if 12 years of abandonment was just a feeling I needed to get over. I stayed calm. I'm not being emotional. Yes, you are, she said quickly. Think about what you're doing. This affects the entire family. I almost laughed again. The entire family? I looked around the cafe briefly, then back at her. You mean the same family that removed me from their lives? Her expression tightened. You know that was a long time ago. 12 years. A long time ago. To her, maybe. To me, it was every birthday she missed. Every hospital visit alone. Every night I cried, wondering why I wasn't good enough. I was 18, I said quietly. Pregnant. And you threw me out like I was nothing. She exhaled sharply. That's not what happened. I stared at her. That sentence, that revision of reality, it told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't here to accept responsibility. She was here to rewrite history. But I wasn't letting that happen. That is exactly what happened, I said. Her voice sharpened. We gave you space to figure things out. Space. I shook my head slowly. You kicked me out of the house and blocked my number. She hesitated for half a second. That hesitation was enough. Then she tried a different approach. We were hurt too, Emily. You don't understand what that did to us. That was it. The moment something inside me shifted completely. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time since she arrived, I smiled. Not warmly, not politely, but with full awareness. You were hurt. She nodded quickly, sensing opportunity. Yes, we were devastated. I nodded slowly. Interesting. I tapped the folder lightly with my finger. Because while you were devastated, I was homeless. Her face tightened. I was 19, I continued. Working part-time, pregnant, sleeping in someone else's house, no money, no support. The cafe felt quieter now, or maybe I just stopped noticing everything else. And you know what I didn't do? I leaned forward slightly. I didn't abandon my child. That landed hard. My mother's expression flickered, just for a second. But I saw it, because I had spent 12 years learning how to read absence from her face. She cleared her throat. We're not here to argue about the past. I nodded. You're right. She looked relieved again. Too early again. We're here to fix a financial issue. I pushed the folder slightly toward her. Not a family issue. Her eyes stayed on me. Yes. Good. I took a breath, then I said it. Then let's treat it like one. She blinked. What does that mean? It was simple. Very simple. I'm not signing anything until I understand everything. Her posture stiffened. That's unnecessary. Everything is already explained. I tilted my head slightly. No, it's not. Silence. Then she said carefully, What do you want? There it was. The real question. Not, how are you? Not, we missed you. Not, can we fix this? Just transaction. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I said the truth. I want honesty. She frowned. We've been honest. I shook my head. No, you've been selective. That word hit differently. She didn't respond immediately, so I continued. You want my signature because you're desperate. Her jaw tightened. The situation is complicated. No, I said calmly. It's simple. I pointed lightly at the folder. You need me. That silence again. I don't need you. That part surprised her. I saw it in her face. She had assumed I would still be the same obedient daughter, the one who craved approval, the one who would fold under pressure. But that version of me didn't exist anymore. She tried one last approach. Emily, if you do this, you're hurting your own family. I nodded slowly. My family is at home right now. That line landed exactly how I intended. She went quiet. For the first time, she looked unsure. Not angry, not controlling, just unsure, because the script wasn't working anymore. She leaned back slowly. What do you want from us? This time, I didn't hesitate. I want acknowledgement. Her brow furrowed. Acknowledgement of what? I met her eyes directly. That you abandoned me? Silence. I want you to say it. Her lips parted slightly, but nothing came out, because saying it would make it real, and making it real meant accepting responsibility. And accepting responsibility was something she had avoided for 12 years. I'm not asking for money, I added. That got her attention. I'm not asking for favors. I tapped the folder again. I'm not even asking for a relationship. Her confusion deepened. Then what is this? I leaned forward slightly. This is consequences. The word hung in the air, heavy, final. Her voice dropped. So you're punishing us? I considered that, then shook my head. No. I paused. You already did that part yourself. Another silence, longer this time, heavier. And for the first time since she walked into my life again, my mother had no control over the situation. No manipulation, no emotional leverage, no authority, just the truth sitting between us. Finally, I stood up. The chair scraped slightly against the floor. My mother looked up quickly. Emily. I held up a hand. No. I picked up my bag. I'll think about it. Her expression shifted immediately. Hope returned. Too fast. But I wasn't done. I looked down at her one last time. And while I think about it, I paused. I want you to remember something. She stayed silent. You didn't lose access to me 12 years ago. I leaned in slightly. You gave it up. Then I walked away. After I left the cafe, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't even feel angry anymore. What I felt was clarity. For the first time, everything was finally out in the open. No more pretending. No more unanswered questions. No more wondering if I had misunderstood the past. Now I knew exactly who they were. And more importantly, I knew exactly who I was. For 3 days after the meeting, my phone kept buzzing. Voicemails, messages, emails, all from my mother. At first, they were polite. Please reconsider. Then they became urgent. We're running out of time. Then, emotional. We're your family. And finally, desperate. We will do anything. Anything. That word stayed with me, because it was the first time I truly understood their situation. Not emotionally, logically. They weren't reaching out because they cared. They were reaching out because they had no other option. Jake noticed the shift in me immediately. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked one evening. I didn't answer right away. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I had studied for exams, paid bills, and raised my daughter. "I'm thinking about everything," I finally said. He sat down across from me. "Whatever you decide, I've got your back." That was all he ever said. No pressure, no judgment, just support. The next morning, I made my decision. I called my mother. She picked up on the first ring. "Emily?" I took a breath. "I'll meet you once more." Relief flooded her voice instantly. "Oh, thank you," I interrupted her. "Not to sign anything." Silence. "This is not a negotiation," I said calmly. "This is me deciding my boundaries." She didn't respond immediately, because she could tell something had changed. When we met again, it wasn't at a cafe this time. I chose a quiet legal office, neutral ground, no emotional leverage, no familiar memories, just documents and truth. My mother arrived with my father this time. Richard Stone looked older, tired. The confidence he once carried like armor was gone. For the first time, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked like someone who had lost control a long time ago. We sat down. No greetings, no small talk. I placed a printed list on the table. "I have conditions," I said. My mother blinked. "Conditions?" "Yes." My father leaned forward slightly. "What kind of conditions?" I looked at both of them. "Before anything is signed, I need honesty." My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father stayed silent. That silence told me everything. I continued. "I want a written acknowledgement." My mother frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you admit what happened." Her face tightened. "That's not necessary for a financial matter." I nodded slowly. "You're right." Then I looked at her directly. "This stopped being just a financial matter when you disowned me." Silence again. Heavy. Final. I slid another document forward. A simple statement draft, nothing dramatic, just truth. That they had cut me off at 18. That I had been left without support. That contact had been completely severed. My father looked at it and immediately shook his head. "No." One word. Sharp, defensive, expected. I leaned back. "Then there is no deal." The room went still. My mother's voice softened. "Emily, please." I didn't respond. Because this wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about accountability. And for the first time, they were the ones being asked to justify themselves, not me. My father rubbed his forehead. "This is humiliating." I almost smiled. Being thrown out at 18 was humiliating. Silence again. The word humiliating now belonged to the right person. Minutes passed. No one spoke. Then my mother finally broke. "Fine." My father turned sharply toward her. "Patricia." But she raised a hand. Just sign it." Her voice was tight, not regretful, not apologetic, but defeated. And for now, that was enough. The document was signed, not perfectly, not emotionally, but legally, and that mattered more in this moment. When it was over, I stood up. So did they. My mother hesitated. "Is that it?" I looked at her for a long second. Then I nodded. "Yes." She looked like she wanted to say something more. Maybe apologize, maybe explain, maybe fix something that had been broken for over a decade. But she didn't. Because people who wait 12 years to speak rarely know what to say when they finally get the chance. My father didn't look at me directly as I turned to leave. That told me everything I needed to know. Nothing had truly changed inside them. Only their circumstances had. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Not because anything had been forgiven, but because something had finally ended. I walked to my car and sat there for a moment. My hands rested on the steering wheel, and I realized something unexpected. This wasn't revenge. Not really. Revenge implies anger. This felt more like closure. A door that had been left open for 12 years was finally shut. Not slammed. Not broken. Just closed. My phone buzzed. A message from Jake. "Done?" I looked at it for a moment, then replied, "Yes." I started the engine. As I drove away, I didn't look back. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't need to. 12 years ago, I was a girl they threw away. Today, I was a woman they couldn't ignore. And in the end, justice didn't come as destruction. It came as truth, and truth was enough.